It was a mild and fragrant morning in early June when the villagers of Little Skelton gathered on the manicured lawns of Greystoke Hall for Lady Greystoke's annual rose luncheon. The event had become a tradition of the highest social order, and though the roses had not bloomed as vibrantly as in previous years, the cucumber sandwiches were crisp, the tea piping hot, and the gossip, as always, plentiful. Miss Jane Marple is seated near the fountain with a crocheted shawl delicately arranged over her shoulders, sipped her tea with quiet interest. Her blue eyes, deceptively gentle and often mistaken for vague, watched the scene unfold with practiced precision. The rose luncheon, she had long concluded, was not about roses at all. It was a pageant, each villager, each guest, each member of staff playing their part in the annual performance of grace and social poise. But it was also, to those with the eye for it, a theatre of small tensions. Lady Greystoke, a tall, willowy widow in her 60s, stood near the trellis with her eldest son, Felix, a Cambridge man with a vague look and a disinclination for practical matters. Felix had recently returned from a tour in the Americas, during which, so the whispers went, he had made a dreadful financial investment involving Peruvian textiles. Still unmarried, whispered Mrs. Finch from Miss Marple's right, and after that business in Boston, who could blame the women? Miss Marple murmured something polite in response, but kept her attention on the young footman in silver livery, moving between the guests. He was tall, not more than 20, with the unmistakable air of someone unused to servitude. His movements were practiced, but lacked the humility typical of long-trained staff. His name, she recalled, was Owen Hargreaves, and he had been employed at Greystoke Hall for only a few weeks. He did not look comfortable, and perhaps that was why Miss Marple noticed. Later, when he failed to return, the luncheon ended without incident, and guests slowly began their farewells. Lady Greystoke smiled and curtsied in her effortless way, while Felix made vague promises of visits and dinner invitations. The servants cleared the tables, but Owen, the footman, was not among them. It was Mrs. Maplethorpe, the housekeeper, who first mentioned it aloud. "Strange," she muttered to the butler. "He's not come back from the stables. I sent him to fetch another jug of lemonade near half an hour ago." By evening, the matter had escalated to concern. The footman's room was found empty, his livery left neatly folded on the bed. His personal belongings, few and plainly kept, remained untouched. No note, no resignation. By morning, he was officially declared missing, and by the following afternoon, the entire village was abuzz. "It's not the first time, you know," said Mr. Tilworthy, the local grocer, to his customer queue. "Vanished, like that maid at Barrow Grange 3 summers ago. Just disappeared." "Poppycock," snapped Mrs. Burdett, the vicar's sister. "People leave service all the time. He probably ran off with some girl from East Sherford." Miss Marple, who had paused by the biscuits, said nothing. But she remembered Barrow Grange. That maid had not eloped. Her body had been found in a wooded ditch 6 weeks later, and her killer never caught. That night, Miss Marple took out her small notebook, the one she never labelled, lest it look too official, and wrote a single line. "Owen Hargreaves did not run away. Someone wanted him to vanish." 2 days after the luncheon, Inspector Cray from the county station visited Greystoke Hall, a man with a steady voice and a sensible moustache. Cray was not quick to speculate. He walked the grounds, questioned the household, and made notes on the silver livery left behind. "No signs of struggle," he said to Lady Greystoke. "No indication of forced departure, just a disappearing man. But no money missing, no valuables touched," she replied. "He was paid a fortnight ago. Took nothing but his shoes. And the staff, all accounted for. No quarrels, if that's what you mean." Cray nodded. We'll notify neighbouring stations. Could be he got a better offer elsewhere. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea by Lady Greystoke, listened with polite interest from her chair beside the rosewood cabinet. Do forgive me, Inspector, she said at last, but might I suggest something rather ordinary? Cray turned toward her, kindly but cautious. Of course, Miss Marple. Well, in my experience, young men with secrets rarely leave their clothes behind, especially when they've only just arrived at a place. It strikes me, rather unnaturally tidy. Cray looked at her more closely. You believe he meant to return? I believe he had no intention of leaving, she replied. Not in the way one walks out a door. That evening, the village gathered at the vicarage for a planned charity musical evening, more sombre now, with the news of Owen's disappearance hanging over everyone. Miss Marple sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, watching the guests arrive and the conversations twist in new and uneasy directions. Felix Greystoke looked paler than usual, and drank his sherry quickly. Mrs. Maplethorpe sat unusually stiff and left before the second performance, and the young kitchen maid from the Horlotty Barns avoided everyone's gaze entirely. Miss Marple made a note of it all. One vanished. Footman, yes, but in Little Skelton nothing truly disappeared. Everything simply waited to be discovered. Little Skelton, for all its tranquil lanes and sweet-briar hedges, possessed the kind of social nervous system that rivaled the most acute of intelligence networks. By the morning following the musical evening at the vicarage, the entire village knew not only that Owen Hargreaves had vanished, but also that he had, depending on the storyteller, run off with the baker's daughter, been seen boarding a train to Brighton, or stolen a silver spoon and gone into hiding in the woods. None of these stories were true, of course, but truth in Little Skelton had never been a prerequisite for belief. Mark my words, said Mrs. Wickham at the butcher's. He was an impostor. That's what he was. Not a real footman at all. The way he carried that tray so stiff in the arms. I said to Ethel, didn't I? He doesn't carry himself like he was born to it. Or maybe he got scared, ventured young Elsie from the post office. You know what they say about Greystoke Hall at night. Old corridors, strange noises. Superstitious nonsense, said Mr. Purvis the chemist, though even he glanced out the shop window, as if expecting someone or something to walk past. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray continued his inquiries, though with diminishing optimism. The lad's possessions remained untouched. There had been no communication, no sighting, no explanation. The local trains had produced no passenger of his description, and no other household had reported a surprise visit or new hire. It was as if Owen Hargreaves had simply evaporated. Miss Marple was not one for chasing down speculation, but she understood its utility. Gossip in a village was like smoke. It might obscure the truth, but it rarely strayed far from the fire. She made her way to the greengrocer's mid-morning, and with her usual soft inquiry, began placing her weekly order. I do hope the Greystoke Hall luncheon won't be the last, she said mildly. The roses were such a delight. Oh, I doubt Lady Greystoke will host another, replied Mrs. Lana, packing carrots with excessive vigour. Not after all this mess. That boy of hers is half the problem. Always traipsing about with no proper purpose. Oh dear, murmured Miss Marple, but I thought he was a great success in South America. Mrs. Lana sniffed. If failure were gold, he'd be richer than the king. Miss Marple, never one to contradict, simply smiled. On her way home, she stopped briefly outside the gate of the churchyard, where she encountered Reverend Julian Hartnell, a man of gentle manners and thin hair, who looked like he belonged in a stained-glass window. A tragedy, this disappearance, he said gravely, as he bent to retrieve a fallen rose petal from the path. "I've spoken with Felix. He's most distressed. Says he barely knew the boy, though." "Oh," said Miss Marple, her eyes widening just a touch. "He was hired by Mrs. Maplethorpe, you see," said the vicar. "Apparently a last-minute replacement after their regular footman fell ill. Something about a London agency." "How interesting," said Miss Marple. She made a small note of it in her mind. London agencies were reputable, or at least trackable. And yet no one seemed to be tracking this particular one. That afternoon, Felix Greystoke paid an unexpected visit to the vicarage. Miss Marple had been having tea with Reverend Hartnell when the young man was announced. Felix, looking somewhat pale and unusually well, greeted them both with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Terribly sorry to intrude," he said, "but I wanted to clarify something I believe has been misunderstood." Asked the vicar, glancing at Miss Marple, who quietly folded her hands in her lap. "It's about Owen," Felix said. I fear I may have given Inspector Cray the wrong impression. You see, I had spoken to the young man more than I admitted. Briefly, just in passing. He seemed uneasy." "In what way, Mr. Greystoke?" Miss Marple asked gently. Felix hesitated. "Well, he mentioned something about someone watching him. A man, I think. Or perhaps, he said it was vague. I didn't pay it much mind at the time." "And this was before the luncheon?" asked the vicar. "Yes," said Felix, eyes shifting slightly. "Just the day before. Near the stables." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "How curious," she said, "that you forgot such a remark." Felix flushed. "Yes, well, I didn't think it relevant. Not until later." When he had gone, the vicar sighed. "Poor lad, always so caught up in things he doesn't understand." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "but I rather think Mr. Greystoke understands more than he pretends." Back at the hall, another disturbance stirred. Mrs. Maplethorpe, the housekeeper, had taken to locking her office when it had never been locked before. She spoke less, kept to herself more, and, according to the kitchen maid Lottie, had burned something in the scullery stove the morning after Owen disappeared. "A letter, maybe," Lottie said nervously when Miss Marple encountered her on the green. "Or a bit of paper. All I know is, she looked pale as a sheet after." "And has she said anything to the inspector?" Miss Marple asked. "She said she had nothing to add. That's what she told him. But she's been jumpy ever since." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A footman vanished. A letter burned. A son with half a truth. A housekeeper guarding secrets. Miss Marple looked out at the road that curved gently toward Greystoke Hall. "It's always the small things," she murmured, "the things no one bothers to lie about." By the third morning after Owen Hargreaves's disappearance, a light mist clung to the hedgerows of Little Skelton, and a hush seemed to settle over the village, as if even the robins had grown discreet, singing more softly from their perches. In the churchyard, Miss Marple, in her pale blue cardigan and sensible shoes, took her customary route to the post office. Not for correspondence, but for conversation. She found Mrs. Beckett alone at the counter, stringing parcels with an unhurried hand. "Morning, Miss Marple," the postmistress said. "No letters today?" No, Miss Marple replied gently. "Just a stroll. The air's so nice when it's a touch damp. Seems to settle the dust in people's voices, don't you think?" Mrs. Beckett blinked at her, then smiled. "Well, yes, I suppose it does." They chatted a few minutes about spring planting and the unfortunate spread of aphids among the village rose bushes, before Miss Marple lowered her voice slightly. "I do hope they find that poor footman. Such a dreadful things so young and so new." Mrs. Beckett's brow wrinkled. Shame, that's what it is. Odd, though he posted a letter the day before he vanished. Oh, Miss Marple tilted her head just slightly. That is interesting. I thought he hadn't sent word anywhere. Well, I suppose it was overlooked, Mrs. Beckett said. He gave it to my niece Lydia, who helps on Thursdays. Said it was personal. Addressed to a Miss Audrey Bell, somewhere in London. Fancy handwriting, very neat. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Young men don't usually send neat letters unless they're terribly fond of their recipient. Mrs. Beckett laughed. You're not wrong there. Maybe he was running off with a girl after all. Miss Marple smiled warmly and left, tucking the name Audrey Bell firmly into her memory. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived again at Greystoke Hall. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea once more by Lady Greystoke for companionship, the widow had said, was present when he questioned Mrs. Maplethorpe about the supposed agency in London that had supplied Owen Hargreaves. Yes, the housekeeper said, Hartley and Bishop, off Russell Square. Quite respectable. We've used them before, though not often. You still have the correspondence? I burned it, she replied, too quickly. Inspector Cray frowned. Why? Mrs. Maplethorpe shifted. It had his references attached. I assumed they were invalid, and I didn't want the clutter. Lady Greystoke looked up sharply. That seems rather precipitous, doesn't it? The housekeeper's mouth tightened. Perhaps I didn't think it necessary to retain forged papers. Holmes, or rather, Miss Marple, though she had studied the great detective's cases with great interest, would have called it a bit too clean. Miss Marple merely said, I suppose it might have been quite a thick packet, then, if you were so eager to burn it. Mrs. Maplethorpe turned her head. It was just 3 pages. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, you needed the kitchen stove. The silence that followed was brief but brittle. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting untouched in her lap. She was piecing together impressions, not facts, not quite, but the threads between facts. She reviewed them aloud, very softly, so as not to frighten the conclusions. 1, she said, we have a footman, newly arrived, hired at short notice, possibly via a real agency, possibly not. He's young, observant, perhaps a little too observant. 2, he posts a letter to a Miss Audrey Bell, likely a romantic interest, possibly someone who knew of his plans or background. 3, he disappears just before his next shift. His livery is left folded, but his shoes are gone. That suggests he changed clothes, probably to leave, but took nothing else. She paused. 4, Mrs. Maplethorpe burns his papers. She set her jaw slightly. And 5, Felix lies about having spoken with him, then admits he heard something troubling. She leaned back. Not a bad start. The next day, Miss Marple did something she rarely did. She wrote a letter herself. It was to a former pupil of her nephew Raymond's, now a junior solicitor in London, requesting, in her delicate, looping hand, a quiet inquiry into Hartley and Bishop, the agency Mrs. Maplethorpe claimed had sent Owen Hargreaves to Greystoke Hall. By tea time, she had a reply, at a full investigation, of course, but a note from Mr. Brinton confirming that Hartley and Bishop had closed 3 years prior, after the senior partner's death. But Miss Marple, reading the letter by the window with a plate of ginger biscuits, allowed herself a soft ah. The next move was to visit Lottie Barnes, the kitchen maid. She found the girl on her afternoon break behind the hall, peeling apples into a pail. Lottie started when she saw Miss Marple, but managed a nervous smile. I didn't take anything, she said quickly. Of course you didn't, dear, Miss Marple said kindly, but I thought you might help an old woman satisfy her curiosity. Lottie hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple sat beside her on the garden bench. "You said Mrs. Maplethorpe burned something." Lottie nodded. "Yes, ma'am. White pages. In the stove. But before that, I saw her reading something. It looked like a letter. Typed or handwritten?" "Typed, but with a signature." "And did she say anything unusual afterward?" Lottie frowned. "She said something about needing to keep the household together, that she wouldn't let him ruin everything." "Him?" The girl shrugged. "I think she meant Mr. Felix." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, just for a moment. "Thank you, dear, that's ever so helpful." That night, a carriage was heard leaving Greystoke Hall. After midnight, it was seen by 2 residents of the village, one returning from a late shift at the telegraph office, the other tending to a colicky baby. Neither saw the passenger clearly, but both noticed the driver, a man with reddish hair and a long coat. Owen Hargreaves had reddish hair, and Owen Hargreaves, it seemed, might no longer be missing, just hiding or being hidden. It was late on a Friday morning when Inspector Cray returned to Greystoke Hall, this time accompanied by a junior officer and a distinctly firmer tone. The disappearance of Owen Hargreaves, initially treated as an unfortunate mystery, was beginning to wear the shape of something more serious. The nighttime carriage sighting had raised fresh questions, and with few solid leads, the inspector began circling a familiar favourite of local police work. "The obvious suspect, I think," Cray said to Lady Greystoke over a cold cup of coffee in the conservatory. "We ought to have a word with your groundsman. Mr. Elbert Nash, is it?" Lady Greystoke raised a fine eyebrow. "Elbert? Why, Inspector, he's been with us for over 20 years. Cray's expression remained neutral. "And I don't doubt his gardening credentials. But he was seen arguing with the boy not 2 days before the luncheon." This was true, though only half true. The argument, such as it was, had been witnessed by no fewer than 3 of the housemaids, who recounted it with escalating intensity. By the time it reached the parlour, Owen had supposedly flung a pair of muddy boots at Elbert's head, and Elbert had threatened to throw the boy into the rose-bushes. Miss Marple, of course, heard the story in its original form, from the milkman's niece, who'd been delivering cream at the time. It were not much, she told Miss Marple, just Mr. Nash saying something about tools not being put back right. The boy looked red in the face, but he weren't shouting. More like embarrassed. A scolding, not a confrontation. But still, Elbert Nash was summoned to the kitchen, where Cray spoke to him in a low voice, while Mrs. Maplethorpe hovered in the doorway like a wary hawk. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her observations from the drawing-room, where Lady Greystoke had retreated to compose herself with embroidery. "Do you trust your staff, Lady Greystoke?" Miss Marple asked gently. The older woman smiled thinly. "One must, Miss Marple, though sometimes it's more an act of faith than fact. I've always found," Miss Marple said, as she pulled a stitch through the hoop she'd brought with her, "that household loyalty often hides things, not necessarily wicked things, but inconvenient truths. People protect each other more out of pride than affection." Lady Greystoke paused in her sewing. "I think, perhaps," she said, "you may be speaking more to my son's temperament than to my staff's." Miss Marple offered a mild smile and said nothing further. That afternoon, Cray paid a formal visit to the groundskeeper's cottage. Elbert Nash was found polishing his shears and looked more annoyed than guilty. "I told you already," he muttered. "I gave the lad a bit of advice. He took it poorly. That's the end of it." "What kind of advice?" Cray asked. "To keep his head down and not ask so many bloody questions." "Questions about what?" Nash looked at the inspector, then at the constable behind him. "About Mr. Felix, and the deliveries coming in from Sherford." Cray straightened. "Deliveries? Crates? Boxes?" came by cart at night. Not proper luggage more, like things that needed hiding. You saw them. I helped unload one. And you told the boy I didn't have to. He saw more than I did, and he knew when something was off. Smart lad. Too smart. Miss Marple, hearing of this exchange second-hand as she always did, felt a familiar tingle in her fingers. The kind she got when a story started becoming too simple. A convenient suspect. A public motive. A familiar scolding. She sat that evening with her notebook and wrote 3 lines. Owen Hargreaves was watching someone. Felix brought in crates late at night. Elbert Nash advised silence not violence. She underlined the last part. It was not the advice of a man preparing a crime. It was the warning of a man protecting a secret that wasn't his. That night Miss Marple visited the vicarage. Reverend Hartnell, ever the gracious host, offered tea and a fire, though the air outside had only the slightest chill. "You don't think Mr. Nash is responsible?" he asked as he passed her a biscuit. "I think Mr. Nash is a blunt instrument," Miss Marple said, "and these crimes tend to be performed with subtler tools." Hartnell chuckled softly. "Still, the constabulary seems eager to close the matter. Can't say I blame them. Villagers are growing restless." "Yes," she murmured, sipping her tea. "Restlessness always makes people long for a conclusion. Any conclusion will do." Hartnell leaned forward. "And what about Felix?" Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "I think Felix Greystoke believes he's in control," she said, "which is a dangerous position for a man who isn't." The next morning brought a new ripple of interest. Lottie Barnes, the kitchen maid, had left the hall in tears. She was spotted running down the back path, with her shawl half fallen from her shoulders, clutching something white to her chest. Mrs. Maplethorpe told the staff that Lottie had been dismissed for clumsiness. "Too many dropped plates," she said, "and she's frightfully jumpy." But Miss Marple, who met Lottie quietly near the back gate an hour later, received a different story. She said, "I knew too much," the girl whispered, "that I was getting above myself. I never said a word, I swear. Just listened." "What were you listening to, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lottie hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she said, "Voices in the corridor outside Mr. Felix's study. Him and Owen arguing something about a letter." "Did you see the letter?" "No, but I heard Felix say, 'If this gets out, it's all over.' That's what he said. He was panicked." Miss Marple's eyes did not widen. She simply nodded and reached out to pat the girl's arm. "You've done very well, Lottie, and you've been very brave." Lottie's eyes filled, and she fled down the lane. Miss Marple, left alone, glanced down at the object. Lottie had clutched a torn scrap of paper that had fallen from her grasp during the run. It was written, a corner of something larger, and though the rest was missing, it bore a single, haunting phrase. "If found, deliver to Miss Audrey Bell, 23 Bicknell Street, W." Miss Marple folded it neatly and tucked it into her sleeve. The circle was closing, but not on Elbert Nash. The next morning, Miss Marple placed the torn scrap of typewritten paper on the table beside her breakfast tray, alongside a single boiled egg and her well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. She didn't need to reread the novel. She could quote large portions of it from memory, but she always found it helpful when needing to reflect on human nature. There was, after all, no clearer portrait of pride, concealment, and subtle manipulations than between its pages. She read the scrap again. "If found, deliver to Miss Audrey Bell, 23 Bicknell Street." WIT confirmed what she'd already heard from Mrs. Beckett, that Owen had written to someone in London. And now here was an address, neatly typed, a quiet connection, almost lost, Miss Marple rose, fetched a small envelope, and wrote a brief note to her nephew Raymond, who had a flat in Chelsea and an impressive fondness for interesting errands when phrased as puzzles. My dear Raymond, could you possibly stop by 23 Bicknell Street and discreetly inquire whether a Miss Audrey Bell resides there? And if so, whether she has recently received or expected a letter from Little Skelton? No need to pry. A gentle curiosity will do. Affectionately, Aunt Jane. She sealed it, addressed it, and walked it herself to the post office, humming lightly as she went. That same morning, Inspector Cray called at Greystoke Hall once again, this time to question Felix Greystoke directly. Felix greeted him in the small study off the library, his tone practiced and his posture a little too poised. "I understand," Cray said, "that you were overheard in a heated discussion with Mr. Hargreaves." Felix blinked. "Oh, by whom?" "That's immaterial," the inspector replied. "What matters is what was said. Specifically, your mention of something getting out." Felix exhaled through his nose. "Look, Inspector, it wasn't anything sinister. Owen, Mr. Hargreaves had stumbled across a personal letter I'd written. I'd left it tucked in a book. He found it, and, well, he made a few implications. Misunderstandings." "What kind of implications?" Felix hesitated. "The letter was unguarded. I had written to someone, a friend, regarding family matters. My mother's finances, specifically. I didn't want it known I'd asked for help from abroad. It's embarrassing, that's all." "You believe he was going to tell someone?" "I feared he might, yes," Felix said, his voice strained. "Not out of malice, but he was curious, far too curious." Cray watched him carefully. "So you asked him to keep silent?" "I begged him to, and I thought the matter was settled. He didn't seem the type to make trouble." Cray made a note. "And yet, he vanished the next day." Felix's mouth twitched. "Yes, I see how that looks." Cray nodded. "Indeed." Miss Marple, meanwhile, took tea that afternoon with her dear friend Mrs. Weatherby, who, by happy accident, had once been acquainted with a Mrs. Hargreaves from Bath. The two older women talked of gardening and marmalade, before Miss Marple mentioned, as if in passing, the unusual disappearance of a young footman. "Oh yes," said Mrs. Weatherby, lowering her voice as if the begonias might overhear. "Owen Hargreaves, that was Sadie's youngest boy. She used to work as a midwife in Bath. Before her stroke, his father died in an accident years ago." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "And the boy, was he raised here in the village?" "No. No boarding schools, mostly, though not the expensive sort. I believe he'd only recently come back to England after working in France. Very bright, always scribbling in journals, according to Sadie." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Scribbling, you say? Diaries?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded. "Yes. Sadie always worried what he might be writing." By Sunday, Miss Marple received a letter from Raymond. "Dear Aunt Jane, yes, there is indeed a Miss Audrey Bell at Bicknell Street, rather prim but polite. She said she had not received any recent letters, though she had been expecting one from someone named Owen. When I asked whether it was a romantic attachment, she laughed and said no, nothing like that. Owen was like a brother to me. Apparently, she had helped him secure a job here in London before he suddenly changed his mind and took the post in the country. She seemed puzzled by it, said he sounded worried last time they spoke, but never explained why. I asked no more, as you instructed. She sends regards. Your devoted errand boy, Raymond." Miss Marple read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it into her drawer beside the torn scrap. Audrey Bell was not a lover, but a confidant, and Owen had confided that he was worried. But worried about what? That evening, she returned to Greystoke Hall under the pretence of returning Lady Greystoke's embroidery pattern. Lady Greystoke was gracious, though distracted, and spoke in vague terms about how trying everything had been. As Miss Marple turned to go, she asked casually, "Might I pop in to see the library again? You have such lovely binding. Believe I spotted a first edition of Trollope." Lady Greystoke hesitated, then smiled. "Of course. Though I fear Felix keeps it rather disorderly." Miss Marple entered the room alone. It was as she remembered, droves of books, many untouched, and a faint smell of lavender and old paper. But she wasn't looking for novels, she was looking for hiding places. Within 5 minutes she found it, behind the volumes of British colonial expansion, a small, cloth-bound book tucked sideways into the gap. She pulled it out slowly. It was a notebook, worn, plain, and unmistakably personal. Inside were pages of Owen's handwriting, observations, names, sketches of the Greystoke grounds, notes about parcels delivered at night, about overheard conversations, and, most damning of all, a list of dates and amounts, marked "Private Ledger, F.G." Miss Marple's lips pressed tightly together. The initials needed no interpretation. Felix Greystoke had a secret, and Owen Hargreaves had discovered it. Miss Marple stood in the Greystoke library, with Owen Hargreaves' notebook in her hand, the fire behind her casting a golden flicker across the embossed spines of dusty books. She did not smile or frown. She simply closed the notebook gently, brushed a thread of lint from its cloth cover, and tucked it securely into her handbag. When she returned to the drawing-room, Lady Greystoke was still seated in her backed chair, threading her embroidery needle with quiet grace. The two women exchanged a few pleasantries about the weather and wool, and Miss Marple soon took her leave with no sign of having found anything out of the ordinary. But inside her mind, things were anything but ordinary. Felix Greystoke, with his calm voice and vacant eyes, had not simply been embarrassed by Owen's knowledge, he had been afraid. The notebook detailed not only suspicious deliveries, but also discreet withdrawals from household accounts and irregular payments to unnamed intermediaries. It painted a picture of a young man quietly taking note of things no one else thought. A footman would observe. Owen, it seemed, had been preparing something. A report, a blackmail attempt, or, more likely, a whistleblowing letter, perhaps to Audrey Bell, perhaps to the press, and someone, Miss Marple thought grimly, had made sure he would never send it. The following morning, Inspector Cray received an anonymous note delivered through the vicarage. It read, "There is a diary hidden in the Greystoke library. It will explain more than any questions will. Ask Felix about the ledger." Cray read it twice, then sent a constable immediately to Greystoke Hall. Felix, when confronted, insisted he had no knowledge of such a diary, but his hands shook slightly. As he spoke, Cray, already growing wary of the man's polished vagueness, demanded to see the library. By midday, the notebook was in his possession. Miss Marple, of course, had made a copy of the crucial pages the night before. As Cray pored over the contents, a fresh theory began to take shape, not of murder in the conventional sense, but of motive, pressure, and panic. Felix Greystoke, saddled with debts from abroad and cut off from certain family resources, had arranged a quiet sale of heirlooms from the horror practice Lady Greystoke would never have permitted. He had received parcels of cash, often delivered through nighttime channels, and had kept meticulous track in a personal ledger, parts of which Owen had transcribed. The notebook also implied that Felix had forged his mother's signature more than once to access funds. Felix denied it all. Their fabrications, he said. Owen had a vivid imagination. "I never harmed him. No one's accused you of harming him, Mr. Greystoke, Cray said flatly, but it's strange you didn't report this notebook stolen or even missing. I didn't know it existed. Strange, Cray repeated. Back in the village, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Theories now abounded that Owen had discovered smuggling, or been part of it. That Felix had sent him to France with a bribe. That Mrs. Maplethorpe had poisoned him out of loyalty. The butcher swore he'd seen Owen's ghost walking along the edge of the woods. The grocer said he'd never trusted Felix and had always said so. Miss Marple said nothing, but she made another visit, this time to Lottie Barnes. The young kitchen maid, now living with her aunt on the edge of town, answered the door with red eyes and clutched a chipped teacup in both hands as they sat together in the cramped parlour. "I think I've brought trouble," Lottie said, her voice breaking. Miss Marple shook her head. "You brought light, dear. That's a very different thing." "I didn't know about the notebook," Lottie whispered, "but I saw Owen the night before he disappeared. He was in the garden, talking to someone." "Someone?" Miss Marple echoed. Lottie hesitated. "I think it was Mrs. Maplethorpe." The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you certain? She had her hair in that scarf she wears when she tends the greenhouse, but I could hear her voice, and she was crying." Miss Marple waited. She said, "You don't understand what this could do to her. She's not strong. If this gets out, she won't survive it." And he said something about how it wasn't about her, that it was right. Miss Marple absorbed the words in silence. It changed things. If Mrs. Maplethorpe had pleaded with Owen to keep for Felix's sake, but for Lady Greystoke's, it suggested something very different from collusion. It suggested panic, loyalty, perhaps even guilt by association. And perhaps it was neither Felix nor Albert Nash who had made Owen vanish. Perhaps someone else, desperate to protect Lady Greystoke, had acted. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Lady Greystoke herself. The usually poised widow looked pale and drawn, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she sat opposite Miss Marple by the fire. "I understand you've taken an interest," she said softly. "I often do, when something doesn't make sense," Miss Marple replied. Equally softly, Lady Greystoke stared into the flames. "I've never been a woman to ask questions of my staff. I was brought up to trust them. But I fear I've been blind." Miss Marple said nothing. "My son, Felix, means well, but he's careless. He believes appearances matter more than truth. I believe Mrs. Maplethorpe may have tried to protect me. But if something has happened to that poor boy, it must come to light. I cannot bear the thought." Her voice cracked. Miss Marple reached out and gently laid a hand over hers. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we protect people not because they are innocent, but because we remember when they once were." Lady Greystoke closed her eyes, but Miss Marple sat back, knitting slowly. There was still more to uncover. But now the secrets had begun to surface. The village of Little Skelton awoke to a bitter wind on Monday morning, the sort that slipped in through cracks and carried with it the whisper of change. Rumours no longer hummed, they clanged, and while Inspector Cray tried to maintain a sense of calm order, it was clear the investigation was shifting into something altogether messier. A new twist had come. At 8:30, Constable Hearn burst into Cray's office with a rain-spotted overcoat and an expression halfway between shock and triumph. "We've found something," he said, breathless. In the woods behind Greystoke Hall, Cray stood immediately. "A body." "No, sir, not a body." He held up a crumpled object mud-smeared, but unmistakable. A footman's jacket, grey-blue with tarnished silver trim. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, had been found a pair of shoes and a slim envelope, sealed with red wax. The name on the front was written in bold, sharp lettering, to be delivered in the event of my disappearance. News of the discovery reached Miss Marple within the hour. She was at the village grocer selecting lemons for a cake when Elsie, the post office assistant, came running breathlessly across the green. "Miss Marple, they've found something in the woods." Miss Marple set the lemon gently back into the basket and turned with remarkable calm. "Have they now?" "Yes, Owen's jacket and a letter, a real one." She offered a small smile. Then perhaps the young man did not intend to vanish so completely after all. At the Greystoke Constabulary, Inspector Cray stood at his desk, reading the letter aloud to a silent room. Present were Lady Greystoke, Felix, Mrs. Mapplethorpe, and quietly in the corner, Miss Marple. "If you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I want it on record that I did not run. I came to Greystoke Hall because I suspected something illegal was being concealed. Fraud, certainly, possibly more. Felix Greystoke is involved. I believe he is selling assets secretly, forging his mother's name, and arranging deliveries from London through private channels. I also believe Mrs. Mapplethorpe is either involved or complicit. She burned the only letter I wrote to a trusted friend in London, and I have reason to believe she knew about the ledgers. Whether she acted to protect Lady Greystoke or herself, I cannot say. This letter is my insurance. I have made copies of the ledger and stored them. If I disappear, they will surface, and someone will come looking." Cray set the letter down slowly. Felix stood stone still, his face unreadable. Mrs. Mapplethorpe had gone ghost-pale, and Lady Greystoke had her eyes closed, as though the words had physically struck her. "Well," Cray said, his voice tight, "this changes things." An hour later, the woods were combed once again. This time, they found the hollow tree where Owen had stored a small parcel wrapped in canvas. Inside, a second copy of his notes, a list of contacts, a bank receipt from a London branch under a false name. Miss Marple studied it all with quiet gravity. "Remarkably thorough for a footman," she said, mostly to herself. Cray glanced at her. "Do you still believe this wasn't a criminal scheme of his?" "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly, "I never thought he was innocent. But in my experience, even guilty men rarely write their own epitaphs in such meticulous handwriting." Cray frowned. "You believe someone else wrote it?" "No," she said, "I believe Owen wrote it exactly as we see it. What I'm questioning is when he wrote it." That evening, Miss Marple returned to Greystoke Hall, summoned discreetly by Mrs. Mapplethorpe, who had requested a private conversation. The housekeeper was visibly strained, the lines of her face drawn tighter than ever before. She served tea, herself an act Miss Marple took as a quiet apology for past distance, and sat in the armchair opposite her with a sigh that seemed to deflate her entire frame. "I didn't mean to mislead the inspector," she said without preamble. "I was trying to protect the household, and Lady Greystoke." Mrs. Mapplethorpe nodded. "She's already lost so much. The estate is in shambles, held together more by reputation than finances. Felix has been desperate. I didn't know the extent of it until Owen started poking around." "Did you burn the letter?" "I did." She looked at Miss Marple with tired eyes. "Not because I wanted him harmed, but because he was going to bring the entire place down. He wasn't being subtle. He thought righteousness would shield him. He was wrong." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Did you know he had made copies of the ledgers?" "No. But I feared as much. He was clever. He wanted to force the truth. And now, I honestly don't know if he left or was taken." Miss Marple's eyes didn't move from her. "But you fear it was the latter?" Mrs. Mapplethorpe said nothing for a moment, then nodded. almost imperceptibly. "I think he met with someone that night," she whispered, "and I think he never made it to the station." By the following morning, the police had widened the search. It was no longer a disappearance. It was officially a missing persons case with suspected foul play. Villagers whispered of murder, of blackmail, of ghosts in the woods. But Miss Marple returned to her garden, pruning quietly while the wind fluttered the edges of the newspaper bearing Owen's photograph. Her mind turned over the final questions. Who had Owen met that night? Who had the most to lose? And why, if this were only about money, did the whole house feel steeped in something more ancient? Not greed, not even fear, but shame. The wind had turned colder by Tuesday morning, with sharp gusts rattling the panes of Miss Marple's sitting-room windows as she poured herself a second cup of tea. The air was thick with the scent of rain and revelation. She had spent the evening, before rereading Owen Hargreaves' recovered notes, letting the details sift and settle. The logic of it was becoming clearer, not just what had happened, but why. And she knew, from long experience, that it was time to lay the trap. Not one made of threats or accusations, but something gentler. A thread drawn taut by silence and civility until the guilty hand twitched. Her opportunity came that very afternoon. Lady Greystoke, pale but composed, had invited Miss Marple and Inspector Cray to join her for tea, an effort, perhaps, to show that order still held sway within Greystoke Hall's ivy-covered walls. The drawing-room was quiet when Miss Marple arrived, the silver laid out with practised elegance. Cray was already seated, reviewing notes in a discreet, leather-bound book, while Felix Greystoke stood near the hearth, arms folded too tightly, eyes too bright. Mrs. Maplethorpe brought in the tea herself. Miss Marple noticed how she avoided looking directly at Felix. As the tea was poured and the lemon sponge served, the conversation circled politely around weather and roses and the latest church roof fund. It was almost theatrical in its delicacy till Miss Marple set down her cup and said, quite pleasantly, "Such a shame about Owen's disappearance. I often think of the way the young try to do the right thing, and how often it costs them more than it should." The room went still, as if the breath had been sucked from it. Felix cleared his throat. Well, he was a difficult boy, overstepped, frankly. "Oh, I don't think he was difficult," said Miss Marple, still smiling, just observant. "That can be uncomfortable, of course." Cray looked up but said nothing. Mrs. Maplethorpe had gone very still. Miss Marple turned to her. "You tried to warn him, didn't you?" The housekeeper's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. I asked him to stop prying, yes, for the good of the household. And he didn't." "No," she whispered, "he wouldn't. Because he thought someone might get hurt. Otherwise," a long pause. "Yes." Felix gave a strained laugh. "Is this really necessary?" "I believe it is," said Cray quietly. Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Felix. "You were frightened, weren't you, Mr. Greystoke? Not only of Owen's knowledge, but of what your mother would think, what the village would say. You had debts, yes, but that wasn't the real secret." Felix's jaw twitched. "The real secret," Miss Marple said gently, "was that the fortune you spoke of, abroad, the Peruvian textile venture, was a lie. You were never in South America at all. You were here, in London. Perhaps even in debtors' lodgings." Felix's face went pale. Lady Greystoke's eyes widened, her breath catching faintly. "You returned not with wealth, but ruin. And you knew that if your mother learned the truth, she would disinherit you, quietly and completely." Felix opened his mouth, then closed it. Miss Marple folded her hands. "So you created the illusion of prosperity. You arranged for items from Greystoke Hall, to be quietly sold art, silver, even a few heirlooms. You used the staff to coordinate the deliveries and employed Mrs. Maplethorpe's loyalty, however reluctantly. Felix's voice was hoarse. None of that proves I harmed Owen. Miss Marple inclined her head. No, but the letter does. The letter? Cray asked. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and removed a folded piece of paper. It arrived yesterday, she said. From Audrey Bell. She found it in a book Owen had mailed her a week before he vanished. Tucked inside, Cray took the letter, scanning it quickly. It's dated before his disappearance, he said, and it mentions Felix by name. He suspected Felix might take steps to silence him, Miss Marple said. But what Owen didn't know was that someone else had been listening. Lottie Barnes. All eyes turned toward her. She overheard the argument the night Owen vanished, Miss Marple said. She heard Felix threaten him, and she saw something else. She paused. Felix followed Owen into the stables. Only one came out. Felix's mouth opened again, but the room was no longer his. Lady Greystoke spoke, her voice trembling. Is this true? Felix looked at her, and for a moment something inside him crumbled. I didn't mean to hurt him, he said. He was going to destroy everything. Miss Marple was silent. He wouldn't stop, Felix whispered. He said he was going to the police, that I was a thief, that you'd disown me. Lady Greystoke said nothing. I just meant to frighten him, Felix continued, to make him listen. I shoved him, he fell. His head struck the corner of the stall. A long silence. Where is he? Cray asked, low and steady. Felix closed his eyes. In the woods, buried behind the old stone marker. I did it myself. The next day, they found the body. Owen Hargreaves, still dressed in a simple worker's shirt, lay in a shallow grave not far from the hidden ledgers. A blow to the skull had been his end. Not planned, but final. Felix Greystoke was arrested without protest. Lady Greystoke watched from the top step of Greystoke Hall, her expression unreadable as her only son was led away. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting beside the fire as the wind howled outside. She paused, tea cooling beside her, and thought of Owen, young, clever, stubborn, a boy who had believed truth was enough to protect him. So many did, and so many were wrong. She resumed her knitting, murmuring to herself, there is justice, and then there is understanding. They do not always arrive at the same time. The trial of Felix Greystoke began 3 weeks after the discovery in the woods. It was a muted affair, held at the county court, where barristers spoke in measured tones and the gallery remained respectfully subdued. The evidence, though circumstantial in parts, formed a seamless whole. Owen Hargreaves' notes, the hidden ledger, the overheard threats, the recovered jacket and shoes, and most damning of all, Felix's own confession painted a picture no jury could ignore. Felix never attempted to retract his words. In the days following his arrest, he remained withdrawn, offering no protest, no self-defense, and no more lies. When asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, he only replied, because I knew what I'd done, and because I hoped no one else would. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for manslaughter. The court acknowledged that Owen's death had not been premeditated, but also that his concealment and deception had been deliberate and unforgivable. Lady Greystoke did not attend the trial. She remained at Greystoke Hall, her windows drawn, her correspondence unanswered. Rumours swirled, as they always did, that she had suffered a collapse, that she had taken to her bed, or that she was making arrangements to leave the country. Altogether, none of those rumours were true. She simply stayed still. One afternoon she received Miss Marple for tea in the conservatory. just as they used to. The roses were fading now, their edges browned and drooping. No luncheon had been planned this season, no garden fete, only the quiet hum of bees and the shuffle of a single silver spoon in a porcelain cup. "He was always too proud, Lady," Greystoke said at last, "too afraid of being seen as weak." Like his father, Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Fear often wears the mask of arrogance. It's easier to be sharp than sincere. I should have seen it. You loved him," Miss Marple said kindly. "That tends to blur the edges." Lady Greystoke blinked back a tear but did not let it fall. "Will the village ever forget?" "No," Miss Marple said, without cruelty. "But in time they will speak of it more quietly, with distance, as they always do." In the days that followed, Greystoke Hall grew quieter. The remaining staff were dismissed or reassigned. Mrs. Mablethorpe, after a tearful conversation with Lady Greystoke, tendered her resignation and left for the coast, where a distant cousin offered her rooms. Lottie Barnes, the kitchen maid who had once feared her knowledge would cost her a future, was given a recommendation by Miss Marple herself and found a post in a respectable home in Cheltenham. Miss Marple sent her off with a handkerchief and a small parcel of sugared almonds. "You have a good memory," she told her. "Use it kindly." Inspector Cray sent his regards from the county, along with a note thanking Miss Marple for her continued assistance in interpreting the human condition. She folded the note, smiled to herself, and placed it in the drawer alongside others like it, quiet acknowledgments of a mind sharper than many Scotland Yard uniforms. As for the village, it did what English villages have always done in the face of tragedy. It continued. The church bells rang again. The greengrocer's sign creaked in the breeze. Mrs. Wickham resumed her morning walks, and the vicar's sister resumed her disapproval of nearly everything. But something had shifted. People were kinder to the Hargreaves name. A small brass plaque was placed on the southern wall of the church, just beneath the window, inscribed simply, "In memory of Owen Hargreaves, faithful in truth." Even when it cost him everything. It was Miss Marple who had suggested the words. One bright autumn morning, she took her usual seat by the fire with a fresh cup of tea and her knitting basket in her lap. Outside, the trees had begun to turn. A golden haze fell across the lane, dappled with the first fallen leaves. As she threaded her needles, she thought not of guilt or punishment, but of courage, not the loud kind, with fanfare and declarations, but the quiet sort. The kind that sits still with discomfort, that chooses not to be silent, even when no one wants to hear. Owen Hargreaves had been brave, and Miss Marple, in her own quiet way, had ensured he would not be forgotten. Her cat curled at her feet. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. She smiled to herself. Not all stories end in comfort, she thought, but the truth, once uncovered, has a comfort of its own. She picked up her needles, and began, once more, to knit.